Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we're in the home stretch of the build of my Team Associated RC10 B6.3 two-wheel drive off-road racing buggy. Now, this is the 5th video in the build series of my B6.3, so if you want to check out the previous video, I'll put a link in the cards in the top corner and I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, in this video, we're going to be focusing on the last two parts bags that come in the RC10 B6.3 kit, and those are parts bags 9 and 10, which should take us pretty much to the completion of the buggy itself. And as in previous build videos, I'll add time markers in the description so you can reference or re-watch specific parts of the build without having to scrub through the entire video. And as always, if you want to follow along with what's coming up next for this B6.3 buggy or any of the other cool RC projects I have planned for the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon to get notifications of whenever I upload the next video. Now, before we get into this build video, I did want to talk about something that was brought to my attention after I uploaded my last video. This is a subject that's been discussed on various Facebook groups and forum sites, so for some this may be common knowledge. However, it's important for those who aren't aware that there are actually a few errors in the supplied instruction manuals that come with your B6.3 or B6.3D kit. Now, for the most part, these errors aren't anything serious and can typically be rectified rather easily, either during the build or just after you're done the affected step. But the really good news is that the folks at Team Associated do provide updated and correct versions of the assembly manuals on their website. All you have to do is simply navigate to the RC10 B6.3 or B6.3D team kit listings, and there you'll find links to downloadable PDF versions of the corrected assembly manuals. And I would highly encourage anyone building their own B6.3 or B6.3D to review these PDF documents either before or even during your own build, and you'll see why as we get into this video. But more on that in just a bit. All right, now that that's out of the way, let's get started by getting into parts bag number 9. Alright, so I've emptied out the contents of parts bag 9 and I've placed all the plastic parts in this bin here. I've placed all the metal parts in this bin here, all the rubber parts in this bin here, and all the fasteners in this bin over here. I've also gone ahead and loosely organized all of these smaller parts within each bin to make them easier to find as I make my way through the build. Now, before we get into the first step of parts bag 9, there are a couple things I do need to mention. First, parts bag 9 deals entirely with the assembly and installation of the front and rear shocks, so we won't be needing the chassis until later in the build. So let's get this thing out of the way for the time being. Second, because we're going to assemble the shocks in the first bit of this video, we're going to be dealing with shock oils, lubricants, and a number of small parts. So I'm going to put down a microfiber towel to help contain any sort of mess. In addition to the microfiber towel, make sure you also have either some paper towels or shop rags close by to absorb any sort of oils once we get into bleeding the shocks themselves. Thirdly, during the build of the shocks, the instructions call for the use of Team Associated's green slime lubricant. Unfortunately, this isn't included in the kit, which is a real shame because it's actually pretty inexpensive. I think I paid about $3 for this tub at my local hobby shop. However, if you haven't already picked some up for your build, I would highly encourage you to do so before you start building your shocks. This product is not only effective lubricant for the shock cartridges, but it also prevents the rubber parts from swelling and wearing prematurely, helping to maximize the life of the shocks between rebuilds. Fourth, if you recall from the previous video, we came across a tool in parts bag number 8 when we were assembling the turnbuckles. Now, I didn't use this tool because I used my own turnbuckle tool. However, for this build, we are definitely going to make use of it, so make sure you have it close by. Speaking of tools, as an optional item, you might want to consider picking up a pair of shock pliers as well. The set that I have here is from ProTech, but these are available from a number of suppliers and can vary in price from 20 bucks to 80 bucks or more. Now, these aren't critical, but they will definitely make your life easier when it comes to building and rebuilding the shocks on your car. All right, so now that we're all organized and ready to go, let's get started with step number 1. All right, so the first part of step number 1 has us installing the shock pistons onto the shock shafts. Now, before we actually get into it, I do want to mention that from what I can see, step number 1, as far as the illustrations are concerned, they're showing what looks like one shock. However, there's various notes and annotations in this step that indicate front shock parts versus rear shock parts. This is important, so keep that in mind when you're building your own, that there are some parts that are different between the front shocks versus the rear shocks. Now, as I said, the first part of step number 1 has us installing the shock pistons onto the shock shafts, so let's gather those parts right now. First, we're going to start with 4 M2 by 4mm button head cap screws, which are right over here. All right, here they are, really pretty small. Next, we're going to need the shock pistons themselves. There's 4 of those, and these are right here. Here they are. I hope you guys can see that. Now, there's a few things I do want to mention about the pistons themselves. First off, you'll notice that they do have numbers on them. The numbers actually denote the size of the holes that are pre-drilled in the pistons themselves. The front shocks get 1.5mm pistons, whereas the rear shocks will get the 1.6mm pistons. Now, the numbers themselves generally are not actually very easy to read. According to the instructions, they give you a little tip where you can run a marker over the numbers. What I did was exactly that, and then I wiped off the excess so I can actually see the numbers a little bit clearer. So try that trick, it'll really help you out. The other thing I do want to mention is when you install these pistons, the numbers themselves should be facing up. So keep that in mind when you're installing yours. Next, we're going to need 4 2.5mm washers, which are all right here. Here's the little 2.5 by 6mm washers, I believe. Next, we're going to need the shock shafts themselves. There's 4 of those. Here are the 4 shock shafts. You'll notice they're different lengths. The front shocks use a 21mm shock shaft, where the rear shocks will use these longer ones, which are 27.5mm. Now, these are the kit shock shafts. These are titanium nitride coated. That's why they have this gold sheen to them. All right, now you'll notice that I have my shock parts sort of organized such that I've got my front shocks on this side and I have the rear shocks on this side. This is very important when assembling these shocks. Make sure that you stay organized. Otherwise, you can end up mix matching parts from front shocks to rear shocks and rear shocks to front shocks, and then you'll end up having to redo everything all over again. So let's go ahead and assemble these. And to do that, we're going to use our trusty shock pliers. So let's do that right now. Okay, so the shock piston and shock shafts have now been completely assembled. These 2 here are the front, and of course these 2 here are the rear. Good. Now, the second part of step 1 calls for the assembly and installation of the shock cartridges into each of the shock bodies. However, before we get on to that, I do need to mention that the kit supplied manual contains a rather serious error pertaining to this part of the build, and it's one that everyone needs to be aware of. Now, as I said earlier, Team Associated has up-to-date manuals available on their site, and I've already gone ahead and printed off the page which contains the correct instructions. I'll try to put on the screen the affected information so you can see it better, but in a nutshell, there's a shock hat bushing that isn't shown in the kit supplied manual, as well as some mislabeling. And if you aren't aware of this before you start assembling your own shocks, you could potentially find yourself with a very poor performing buggy once you have everything put together. So I can't stress enough the importance of printing the updated PDF manual on Team Associated's site for your own build. In fact, you're probably better off building from that versus the kit instructions. Now, the good news is I've gone through the rest of the kit manual and compared it to the PDF manual, and I haven't come across any other issues. So following the kit manual beyond this point shouldn't be a problem. But for this specific part, we'll be following the updated PDF document. So now let's gather what we need and get started. But before we do, let me clear off some space so we can actually get into it a little bit here. All right, so first thing we're going to need 4 12mm shock cap O-rings, which are right here. And there they are. Next, we're going to need the shock bodies themselves, and they are right here. There they are right here. Very nice machined aluminum pieces. Now I should mention there are 2 different sizes. These 2 here are the rear shocks. They're slightly longer. These 2 here are the front shocks. They're slightly shorter. Next, we're going to need 4 bottom cap O-rings, which are right here. That's those right there. Next, we're going to need our shock hat bushings and shock spacers, which are actually on this sprue right here. These are the shock hat bushings right here. They have a small boss on them, which I'm hoping you can see on camera here. And these here are the shock spacers, here and here. Now, because these are on a sprue, when you cut them off, make sure that you get all the plastic off of them. You don't leave anything, otherwise they could bind up within the shock. Let's get them all off. We're going to need 2 shock hat bushings per shock and 1 shock hat spacer per shock. So let's get these off this runner right now. All right, so next we're going to need our X-rings. Now there's 2 X-rings per shock, which means we're going to need 8 of them, and they are all right here. There they are, 8 X-rings, 2 per shock. And last, we're going to need our shock bottom caps, which are right here. There they are, very nice anodized blue pieces. Okay, so now we're ready to get started. All right, so to get started, we're going to install the shock cap O-ring and the bottom cap O-ring onto each of the shock bodies. But before we do, the instructions actually call for a small amount of shock oil to be added and rubbed onto each of the O-rings themselves. And this actually accomplishes 2 things. 1, it makes it easier to actually slide the O-rings into place. And 2, it actually causes the O-rings to plump up a little bit so that when we actually install the cap on the top and the bottom cap, they'll actually seal up a little bit better. So let's get started by doing that right now. First, I'm going to use my trusty tray and a little bit of shock oil. It doesn't really matter which one you use. I'll just add a little bit there. Take an O-ring and just sort of slide it around. All right, so that is the first shock body with the top and bottom O-ring installed. I'll go ahead and do the same thing for the other 3. All right, so now all the shock bodies have their respective O-rings installed. Now we can move on to assembling and installing the cartridges. when it comes to installing the shock cartridges into the shock bodies, there are a couple of different methods that I've seen people use. One is to quite simply take each component of the shock cartridge, insert it into the bottom of the shock body, and then cap it off with the bottom cap. However, I'm going to use a different method, which I think will probably be more beneficial for you guys watching to see the actual shock cartridge stack up on video. And that method involves using a 2.0 millimeter hex wrench and putting each of the shock cartridge components onto the shaft before actually threading it into the shock body itself. So let's do that right now. First thing, we're going to take our shock hat bushing. I'm hoping you guys can see that on camera, but the boss, or I guess the hat portion, is actually going to be facing the handle. Second, we're going to need one of our X-rings. Third, we're going to need a shock spacer. Then we're going to need another X-ring, followed up by the last shock hat bushing. Now there you can see the cartridge stack up. So we have the shock hat bushing, an X-ring, a spacer, another X-ring, and then the final shock hat bushing. Now, before we actually put this into the shock body, the instructions actually call for green slime to be applied to the two X-rings. Now, for those of you who've been following along with the build, you all know that the way that I prefer to apply any sort of grease is to use a syringe. So I've loaded up a syringe with some Team Associated green slime, which should make it a lot easier to apply to the two X-rings. So let's do that right now. All right, so our shock cartridge stack now has green slime applied to the X-rings. So now that the shock cartridge is complete, we can now insert it into the shock body. And now the cartridge is inside the shock body. Next, we take our bottom cap and we thread it into place. What I do not tighten up the bottom cap at this point. I let it touch the O-ring and then I back it out just a tiny bit. And the reason why is because I don't want to put any unnecessary pressure on the X-rings at this point. The next step is going to have us install the piston and shock shafts into the shock bodies themselves. So I don't want to risk damaging the X-rings when I do that. So at this point, I'm just going to put the shock cap on, but I'm not going to fully tighten it. So now, that shock body is complete and ready to accept the shock piston and shaft. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the other three shocks. Okay, so that is all of the shock bodies completely assembled, ready for the shock shaft and piston assemblies to be inserted. And that brings us to the end of step number 1. Let's move on to step number 2. All right, so the first part of step number 2 has us installing the shock shaft and piston assembly into each of the shock bodies. Now, before we do that, the instructions actually tell us to add a little bit of green slime onto the threads so that it makes it easier for it to make its way past the cartridge itself. So let's do that right now. All right, so the first shock is now done. I'm going to tighten up the cap. As you guys remember from the last step, I left it a little bit loose. This is now the time to tighten up that cap. Perfect. Now I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing with the other 3 shocks. All right, so now the shock shaft and piston assemblies are now installed in the shock bodies themselves. The second part of step 2 has us installing eyelets onto the ends of the shock shaft. So let's gather all the parts we're going to need in order to get that done, starting with our nylon spacers. Now, according to the instructions here, the front shocks don't get any spacers, while the rear shocks get 1 spacer each, which means we're going to need a total of 2 of them, which are right over here. There they are, 2 nylon spacers. Next, we're going to need 4 shock pivot balls, and those are right over here. There we are, 4 pivot balls. And next we're going to need the eyelets themselves. Now, the eyelets are actually on this sprue right here. And we can see there's 2 different lengths. So we have short eyelets here, and we have slightly longer eyelets here and here. However, according to the instructions, there's actually 3 eyelet lengths. So the short ones are considered 0 millimeter, so I guess those are reference size. The longer ones are 2 millimeters longer, which are these ones here, and there are an even longer set of eyelets, which are 4 millimeters longer. Now, the longer eyelets are actually not in bag 9, but instead are found in bag 10 on this sprue right here. And they're actually located here and here. Now, fortunately for us, the instructions actually only call for the use of the short eyelets and the long eyelets. So we won't actually need the longer eyelets. They're provided largely for tuning reasons. So if you're running your car and you find that you need a little bit more suspension length, those are the ones that you'll be using. But in our case, because we're going to be following the book build or the instruction build, we're only going to need 2 of the short eyelets and 2 of the slightly longer or the long eyelets. So let's get these off the sprue right now. All right, so now we can get started. First things first, we're going to install the nylon spacers onto each of the rear shocks. So let's do that right now. There's the nylon spacer installed on one of the rear shock shafts. Push that all the way up to the cap. All right, next we can install the pivot balls onto each of the shock eyelets. Now, in order to do that, we can use our trusty shock shaft tool. Here, let me show you how that's done. You insert the pivot ball onto this piece here on the tool itself, and then you take your eyelet and you just push. And there we are. That is a fully assembled eyelet. So I'll go ahead and do the rest of them the same way. There we are. All the pivot balls are now installed in each of the eyelets using the shock shaft tool. By the way, you can actually use the shock shaft tool to remove the pivot balls if you so need to, which is yet another reason why you should probably consider getting one of these tools. Now, to install these eyelets, it's actually really pretty simple. Take our shock, we'll start with one of the fronts, put it into our shock tool, and then take the eyelet and just begin threading it onto the shock shaft. And there it is. The eyelet is now installed on the end of the shock shaft. Now, the one thing I do want to mention, I've stopped right at the end of the threads that are on the shock shaft. And the reason why is because later on, we're going to actually be measuring the stroke length. So I may need to go a little further up or a little further down once we actually get to that point. So stop at the end of the threads. Don't go any further than that. Now, I'll just go on and do the same thing with the rest of the shocks. All right, so as we can see, all the eyelets have now been installed on each of the shocks. That brings us to the end of step number 2. Let's move on to step number 3. All right, so step 3 has us filling and bleeding the shocks we've just finished assembling using the included shock oils that came in our kit. Now, arguably, this step is probably the most critical when it comes to assembling shocks. If this isn't done correctly, the shocks themselves could perform very unpredictably, which could ultimately hamper the performance and the handling of the buggy itself. So I can't stress this enough, take your time and make sure you get this right. Now, with that said, let's gather all the parts we're going to need in order to complete step 3. First, let's get our shock caps. Now, the shock caps are actually on these 2 screws right here. So let's get the shock caps off right now. All right, next we're going to need 4 M2 by 4mm button head cap screws. These are the actual bleed screws that go into the caps, and they are right over here. There they are, tiny little things. Of course, we're also going to need our shock oils, which are right over here. Now, the kit itself included 45 weight shock oil and 35 weight shock oil. The 45 weight shock oil will be going into the front shocks, whereas the 35 weight oil will be going into the rear shocks. So we'll keep those close by. And the next thing we're gonna need is a shock stand. Now, if you don't have your own shock stand, they're not very expensive. Now, myself personally, I have one that I printed off. This is a model that I just found on Thingiverse. It's nothing special. If you have access to a 3D printer, I would highly suggest that you go ahead and print one off. If not, consider getting your hands on one, because this thing is actually really important, especially if you're getting into this hobby where it might require you to rebuild your shocks on occasion. All right, so let's get started. All right, so the first thing we have to do in step 3 is to thread each of the bleed screws into the shock caps. So let's do that right now. All right, so now that we've threaded each of the bleed screws into each one of the shock caps, we're ready to start filling. Now, I'm gonna start with just one of the front shocks for the time being. So first things first, make sure that the shock shaft is fully extended before you start adding any fluid. Now in this case, we're gonna be using the 45 weight silicone shock fluid that came with the kit, and we fill it up about 3/4 of the way. That looks like it's about 3/4 of the way up. Next, move the shock shaft up and down very slowly. To allow any air bubbles to make their way out. Now, once you're done with that, put the shock in the stand and let it sit for a bit. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing with the rest of these shocks. Like this last one, the front shock will be getting 45 weight oil, and of course the rears will be getting the 35 weight oil, but it's the same procedure. All right, so now that the shock bodies have been filled 3/4 of the way up, and you notice that I moved the shock piston up and down in each of the body a couple of times, now we just let them sit and wait, let the bubbles kind of make their way up. Now, there's no hard and fast rule as to how long you're gonna let them sit and wait. I usually like letting them sit for about 15 to maybe 20 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes. So once that's done, we'll come back and we'll fill them all the way to the top.
Many minutes later.
All right, so it's been about 30 minutes now, and as we can see, there's no bubbles in any of these shocks. So all the bubbles have completely dissipated, and now I can go ahead and top up each one of the shocks with their appropriate fluid. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now. All right, so now that all the shocks have been completely topped up with their respective fluids, we're ready to go ahead and install the shock caps onto each of the shocks and then go ahead and bleed them. Now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do this procedure on one of the shocks. Once I've got that all done, I'll go back and repeat the process for the other three. So let's get started. First things first, we're gonna take our bleed screw and put it on the end of our hex driver and put that off to the side for now. This is really important, and we'll see why when we actually get into bleeding the shocks themselves. Next, the instructions call for a drop of fluid inside each of the shock caps. So I'm gonna do that right now. Set that off to the side. Now, with our cloth or paper towel, we take our shock and wrap it so that it catches any fluid that may drain out. Now, we've got to be very careful here. You don't want to push on the shock shaft at this point. We now take our shock cap and thread it onto the shock body. Now, at this point, we can actually use the tool that we talked about earlier, this tool right here, and you can actually put it on the bottom of the shock body, and then using your wrench, you can tighten up the shock cap itself to ensure that it's nice and tight. Now, the shock is assembled and we're ready to bleed it. So let's go ahead and bleed it. Now, the process to bleed this is really quite simple. We slowly push up on the shock shaft and allow any oil to drain out. Once the shock shaft is at the top of its stroke, go ahead and put in the bleeder screw. Now, we pump this up about 20 times. So let's do that right now. Now, I've pumped this up about 20 times and I pulled the shock piston all the way to the bottom of its stroke. So let's see what happens when I let go. Okay, so there's no movement here. That's a good sign. Push it all the way up. Let's see what happens. Very little movement. Now, in this case, this shock needs to be rebled. We do not want any movement either when I pull the shock shaft all the way down or when I push it all the way up. What we want is what's called a dead shock. So we don't want to see any sort of movement. So in this particular case, I'm going to pull the shock shaft all the way down. I'm going to remove the bleed screw. Leave it on the end of your hex wrench. Grab cloth, wrap it around, and then we repeat the process again. So we just push up slowly on the shock shaft to bleed out any additional fluid. Then once we reach the top, reinsert the bleed screw. Wipe off any excess. We can pump it up again. Now, when I let go, I don't see any movement. I push up. I don't see any movement. And that's exactly what we want. We want what's known as a dead shock. Perfect. That is one shock that's completely bled and ready to go. Now, I'll repeat the process for the other three. All right, and there we have it. 4 shocks now completely bled. Now, the next step we have to do is we have to actually measure and set the stroke of each one of the shocks. So the front shocks are supposed to have a 24mm stroke, and the rear shocks are supposed to have a 28mm stroke. So let's see if we can do that right now. So here we can see the stroke is actually too short. So what I have to do is turn this eyelet back out to get to our 24mm stroke. So let me do that right now. Right, that one is now set. I'll now go ahead and repeat this process for the other 3 shocks. There we have it. All 4 shocks completely bled, as well as the stroke lengths have all been set. That now brings us to the end of step 3. Let's move on to step number 4. All right, let's get on to step number 4. Now, step 4 begins with us assembling the threaded collars that go onto each of the shocks. Now, let's gather the parts together in order to do that. First, we're gonna need 4 12mm O-rings, and they are right over here. There they are. And next, we're going to need the 12mm threaded collars themselves, which are over here. There they are right there. Very nice anodized blue aluminum pieces. All right, now assembling these is actually relatively easy. We just have to put an O-ring inside the top of each of these collars. Just like that. Hope you guys can see that on camera. But there it is. There's actually a groove right on the inside below this top surface that the O-ring rides in. Now I'll just go on and finish them up. All right, so the shock collars are now complete with their O-rings installed. The next part of step 4 has us installing the shock collars onto each of the shocks themselves. But before we do, the manual actually gives us a little tip here where it says we should use our finger to rub a small amount of shock oil onto the rubber O-rings that we installed in each of the collars. So let's do that right now. I'm going to use my parts tray, add a little bit of oil, and let's do this right now. All right, so our collar ring is now oiled up. Let's go ahead and install it on the first shock. Now, it's important to note before we get to the top that the manual shows us spacing for the shock collar, that is to say from the top of the shock collar to the bottom of the shock body itself right here. For the fronts, it's supposed to be 4.2mm, and for the rears, they are supposed to be 8.7mm. So make sure we get that set as we finish this assembly. Perfect. That shock is now complete. I'll go on and repeat this process for the other 3 shocks. All right, so that now are the shock collars all installed on their respective shock bodies. Now the last part of step 4 has us installing the springs and the spring cups onto each of the shocks. Now let's gather our springs together first. We have our springs. Obviously these are the rears and these here are the fronts. Next we're going to need our spring cups themselves, which are on these sprues right over here. Here they all are. Now, there's a lot of spring cups that we're given. In fact, we're given 3 different sizes. So these ones here, I hope they come through on camera, but these ones here are what are called 0mm or 0 offset spring cups. These are the shortest ones. The next are these here. They're a little bit longer. These are 5mm offset spring cups. And then we have these here, which are the longest ones that are included in the kit. And these are 9mm offset spring cups. Now, according to the instructions here, we only need the 0mm and the 5mm spring cups, so we don't need the 9mm for now. And the 0mm spring cups are used on the rear shocks, and the 5mm spring cups are used on the front shocks. So we're going to need 2 of these, and we're going to need 2 of these. So let's get those off the runners right now. All right, so we're now ready to install our springs onto our shock. So let's do that with one of these. First, slide the spring over the shock, exposing the shock shaft. Then, with the slot of the cup, put that over the shock shaft. Then, there we are. That's 1 complete shock. Now I'll go ahead and just repeat the process for the other 3. All right, so that is now a complete set of shocks, both front and rear. That brings us to the end of step 4. Let's move on to step number 5. All right, so step 5 has us installing our newly assembled shocks onto the buggy itself. So first things first, let's get the chassis. Now, the first part of step 5 has us installing the front shocks onto the front suspension. Now, in order to do that, we're going to need a couple of parts. First things first, we're going to need 2 M3 by 20mm button head cap screws, which are right over here. There they are. And we're also going to need 2 M3 lock nuts, which are right over here. There they are. Okay, so let's go ahead and install our front shocks. Now, a couple of things I do want to mention. First and foremost, the bleed screw, as far as the instructions are concerned, the bleed screw faces inward towards the inboard side of the vehicle. And second, there's a note here in the instructions that say we are to use the outside hole in the front arm. So let's go ahead and install our front shocks. All right, so that is the first front shock installed. I'll go ahead and install the second one. All right, so now that's both front shocks installed on the front suspension. So now the second part of step number 5 has us installing the rear shocks. Now the rear shocks are a little bit easier because all we need are 2 M3 lock nuts per shock, meaning we need 4 of those, which are right over here. There they are. And these go on much like the front shocks. The bleeder screw should be facing inboard. And another note to mention is to make sure that the flange, which is right here. The flange on the pivot ball should be up against the rear arm. So let's do that right now. All right, so that now is the rear shocks installed on the rear suspension. Good. And that brings us to the end of parts bag 9. Let's now move on to parts bag 10. All right, so I've gone ahead and emptied out the contents of parts bag 10. I've placed all of the plastic parts in this bin over here, all the metal parts in this bin over here, and all of the fasteners in this bin over here. Now, before we actually get into the first step of parts bag 10, I did want to mention that now that we have the shocks installed on the buggy itself, it is a really good idea at this point to actually put your buggy onto a car stand. It'll make it a lot easier going forward to finish off the assembly and actually work on the buggy itself. Now, car stands are generally speaking not all that expensive. However, if you want to use a great budget option that I recently discovered, it is this right here. It is a yoga block. In fact, I picked this up at Walmart. It cost less than $4, and in all honesty, it works really, really well. And as a budget option, this is great to throw in your pit bag and take with you to the track, or use it as your main car stand. This actually works really well, and I'll bet it'll work well with 8-scale vehicles as well. So now that the car is up on a car stand and we can work on it a little bit easier, let's go ahead and get into step number 1. Oh, one more thing I did want to mention before we get into step number 1. It's that parts bag 10 calls up and references a number of parts that actually aren't included with your B6.3 kit. I'm talking about items like motor, cooling fan, battery, wheels, tires, receiver, electronic speed control. These sorts of things are not included with a B6.3 or B6.3D kit. Now, in my case, I already have all the parts I need in order to finish my buggy, but in your case, you may not. So if you don't, you may find that there are some steps in parts bag 10 that you may not be able to complete. And that's okay. You can still follow along with this build. Now, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into step number 1. All right, now the first part of step 1 has us installing the pinion to the motor and then the motor to the gearbox. Now, neither the pinion nor the motor are included in the kit, so you'll have to purchase those separately. And that will largely be dictated by the class of racing you decide to enter. But we'll talk about that bit in just a little bit. First, let's gather all the parts that actually came in parts bag 10 that we're going to need to get this part of step 1 finished up. First, we're going to need 2 3x8mm washers, which are right over here. There they are. Next, we're going to need 2 M3x8mm button head cap screws, which are right over here. There they are right there. And next, we're going to need both our pinion and motor. Now, in my case, I've chosen the Trinity Ultralight Alloy 29 tooth pinion, and the motor I've chosen is the Reedy Power S++ brushless competition 17.5 turn motor. Now, the reason I'm showing you these together is because your motor selection will directly affect which pinion you can run on your buggy. As I said in my first video, my intention with this particular B6.3 is to run it in the stock buggy class, which dictates that I have to run a 17.5 turn motor. Now, on page 21 of the instruction manual, there is a table which suggests the appropriate sized pinion and spur gear based on the motor you've decided to run. And for 17.5 turn motors, the suggested pinion size is 29 tooth. This is important because installing a pinion that's too big or too small could result in unfavorable performance from your buggy and overheating of the motor, causing some permanent damage. Now, there are a number of different pinion manufacturers as well as a number of different motor manufacturers in this hobby, and I'm sure some of you might be asking why I've chosen this particular pinion and motor combination. Well, my choice for pinion was simple. The ultra light alloy pinions from Trinity are considerably lighter than the aluminum pinions available from Team Associated. And when you're running in a stock class, rotational mass is important. The reason I chose the Reedy S++ motor is largely based on what the majority of the fast guys at my local track are running. I figure if the fast guys are running Reedy, there's got to be a reason. Besides, if I'm running the most popular motor that's used at my local track, there's a good chance I'll be able to turn to the group of racers for an answer should I encounter any issues. And I would suggest the same approach if you haven't already purchased a motor for your own B6.3. Visit your local track and ask around as to what everyone is running. That way you won't end up with some off-the-wall motor choice where if you run into an issue, you won't have any options for support or assistance. All right, with all that said, let's get into the installation of the pinion onto the motor and then onto the buggy itself. Okay, so there is the pinion, and hopefully you guys can see that, but there's a number printed on the sides, 29 tooth, and of course the grub screw that holds it into place. Now, according to the instructions, the B6.3 does not come with a grub screw for a pinion, so make sure you don't lose this. Now, I haven't actually opened this box yet, so I guess we get a bit of an unboxing as well. We get what looks like an owner's manual. And of course, we get the motor itself. There it is. Brand new Reedy powered S++ 17.5 competition grade motor. And it includes a sensor wire as well. All right, so let's install the motor into the gearbox, and then once the motor is installed, we'll install the pinion onto the motor shaft. So let's do that right now. Okay, so the motor is now mounted onto the gearbox. Now, it's not tightened down. The motor itself is actually free to rock back and forth and move. And the reason why is once we put the pinion on, we have to set the gear mesh. So we need the motor to be a little bit loose so that it can move around. So let's install the pinion right now. Okay, so now, I hope you guys can see that on camera, but the pinion is now mounted onto the motor shaft and I've centered it onto the spur gear. Now we have to set the gear mesh. Now, the way I set the gear mesh is a little bit old-fashioned, but it has worked for me quite a bit in the past, so let's do that right now. Now the way I set gear mesh is I just use a small strip of regular ordinary paper and I slip it in between the spur gear and the pinion gear and then push the motor up against the spur gear and then tighten the motor mount bolts down. So let's do that right now. And there we are. The gear mesh is now set. Now we move on to the next part of step number 1. Now the next part of step number 1 has us installing the optional fan onto the chassis rail here. Now again, much like the motor and the pinion, the fan is not included in the kit, so it is an optional piece. Now most people will tell you that a fan is a definite must. I've gone ahead and actually picked up a fan, which is a Reedy 30mm aluminum motor fan. This has a 195mm extension extension in case you need it, but this is the one I'm going with right here. So let's take this out of the package and get it ready to be installed. There's the fan right there. Very, very nice. Now, in order to complete the installation of the fan, we're also going to need a fan mount, which is on this sprue right here. In fact, you'll notice there's two parts on this sprue. This part is the fan mount. This one here is a cap. In case you're not using a fan, you're supposed to install the cap on the chassis rail there. Obviously, we're using a fan, so I'm gonna cut this piece off of the sprue right now. And next, we're going to need a M3 by 16 millimeter button head cap screw, which is right here. And then finally, we're going to need an M3 by 10 millimeter flush head cap screw, which is here. Let's get started. So the first thing we're going to want to do is install the fan mount to the fan itself. Now, before we actually do this, I do want to mention something very important, and that is the orientation of the fan itself. Now, you'll notice the fan, I guess, has sort of a brace or a structure on this side, and it's open on this side. This side should be facing outboard of the vehicle. And this is important for airflow, to make sure that fan is moving the air in the correct direction. So let's put this fan mount onto the fan itself. All right, so the fan mount is now attached to the fan. Now we just have to install this onto the chassis itself. All right, so the cooling fan is now installed onto the chassis. And that now brings us to the end of step one. Let's move on to step number two. All right, so moving on to the first part of step two shows us installing most of the electronics that we're going to need on our buggy. Now, the first bit that's shown here is the installation of the transponder. The transponder is typically not included with your kit. Transponder is purchased separately. In my case, I actually don't have a transponder just yet, so I won't be able to actually complete this step of the build. But I did want to mention something that people have asked me about in the past, and that is that if you look at the instruction, it shows the transponder being installed using a small bracket. And I've had people ask me in the past where this bracket is located in the B6.3 kit, and the answer is it isn't. That bracket is actually included when you purchase the transponder itself. So Team Associated does not actually supply you with the bracket. That comes from the transmitter supplier. So don't bother looking for one, it isn't in the kit. Now, moving on, the next thing that these instructions show you is the installation of both the receiver and the electronic speed control, or ESC. Now, again, neither of these items are included in your kit, so you have to purchase these separate. Now, in my case, the receiver that I'm going to be using is a Sanwa RX482. Now, this receiver is an antennaless 4-channel receiver that came with my MT44 transmitter. That's the transmitter that I've decided to use for my B6.3. It's not the highest end transmitter, but it's certainly not an entry-level transmitter either. It's what's considered a mid-range transmitter. It has enough features on it that I think will last me quite a while without having to spend the big dollars for a high-end transmitter. Next, we need the ESC. Now, in my case, I've gone with a Reedy Power 510R black box ESC, or electronic speed controller. And again, this was another one of those decisions where I asked around some of the people at the tracks that I visited, and this came up as the most popular option that the folks tend to use. So I decided to go with this one, largely because if I have any issues with it, or if I need any help in tuning it, there'll be plenty of people around that I can pull from. Now, the next thing we're going to need is what's called servo tape. Now, the kit does include servo tape. This is what it looks like, and what we'll have to do is obviously cut it and use an appropriately sized amount in order to actually mount the receiver and ESC, and both are mounted to this metal plate that we installed very early on in the build. Another thing I did want to mention about this step is that it shows the installation of an antenna tube and cap. Now, the kit does include an antenna tube, but as I've mentioned, my receiver is actually an antennaless receiver, so I won't be needing this. However, if you do need it, it is included. You can obviously change its length depending on how long the antenna is. And the kit also includes a small M3 by 3mm grub screw, which is right here, which you can use to hold the antenna tube in place. But again, I don't need it, so I'm going to set this off to the side for now. Now, before we mount the receiver and the ESC onto the buggy itself, first, we gotta actually open this box up. This is still sealed. Look at that, 2 unboxings in 1 video. Let's get into this right now. We get an owner's manual, instructions on how to connect it, gives all of the default settings, and even more settings, some warnings. Definitely gonna need this. The ESC itself, there it is, fresh out of the box with all the wires attached, also capacitor. All right, and I guess that's everything. Good, so I guess now we can start getting ready to mount these items onto the chassis itself. Now, first things first, what I want to do is apply some servo tape to the bottom of both the receiver as well as the ESC. And then we'll position them where we want them to be. Then I'll peel off the rest of the servo tape backing and put them in their final position. So let's do that right now. All right, so servo tape on the receiver. All right, and now the servo tape has been applied to the ESC. So now we can figure out how to mount the ESC and the receiver to the buggy. Now, looking at the instructions, the ESC is sort of positioned in this fashion. Now, generally speaking, what you want is the ESC wires to be sort of as short as possible to get to the motor itself. The other thing that we want to take care of is also where the sensor wire will go from the motor to the ESC. Generally speaking, the common practice is to actually run the sensor wire from the motor through this channel and then to the ESC. And ultimately, we want to have the best access to where that sensor wire plugs into the ESC. And in the case of the 510R, that sensor port is right on the back, right near all these wires, right there. It would seem to me the best place to mount the ESC would be right about there, and the receiver can be mounted right there. So I think that is probably the best setup for my ESC and receiver. So let me go ahead and start removing the tape and mounting them to the chassis. Okay, so now it looks like all of my electronics are currently installed in the Buggy. Now, I've done this as relatively clean as I can. I may have to go back in and possibly clean things up just a little bit. However, as you guys probably saw, I connected the sensor wire to the ESC, ran it through the channel, threaded it through and left it in place. I'm holding that sensor wire down using just simple black electrical tape. I've decided to rearrange the capacitor and the receiver. So I now have the capacitor off to the side here and the receiver next to it. And the big reason why I did that was in my earlier configuration, the ESC and the receiver actually sat a little further back than I would have liked. I wanted the ESC a little bit further forward. So by reconfiguring this way, I was able to move the ESC right to the edge of the plate that it's sitting on. I have also connected the steering servo as well, and I'm just kind of taking up the slack using a couple of zip ties. Now, the only reason why I haven't actually connected the ESC to the receiver just yet is because this plug actually doesn't fit into the Sandwell receiver. Sandwell receivers actually have very, very tight fitting connectors. So I may need an adapter, or I may need to sort of shave this connector down a little bit in order to get it to fit in there, which I'll probably end up doing off camera. You'll also notice I haven't actually connected the wires to the motor yet. I'm not going to be doing any soldering in this video. Soldering in and of itself is a topic in a practice that could easily be its own video, so I won't be doing any of that. In this particular case, I'm just going to leave the wires loose the way they are. So that now brings us to the end of the first part of step 2. Let's move on to the second part of step 2. All right, so the second part of step 2 has us installing 2 battery strap shoulder screws into these 2 bosses on the chassis side rails. Now, these 2 screws are used to hold the battery strap into place. Now, the screws themselves are right here. There they are right there. Now, 2 things to be aware of. Number 1, the longer portion of the screw is what's actually going to go into those 2 bosses on the chassis rails. And the second thing to be aware of is that this top surface of the shoulder screw itself right there, that needs to be flush with your battery pack. Now, if you don't have a battery pack yet, then go ahead and install them, but know that you'll probably have to adjust their height once you do get a battery pack installed. In my case, I do have a battery pack. The pack I've decided to go with is a Reedy Power Zappers SG4. This is a 2S LiPo battery pack that is 115C, 4800 milliamp hour battery. And much like the ESC and the motor, this too also hasn't been opened. So that makes 3 unboxings in one video. Casey Neistat didn't open this many boxes during his famous mail time segment. And there is the battery pack that I'll be using. It comes with some bullet connectors and of course a safety sheet. Let's get started by installing these shoulder bolts into the chassis rails themselves. These out of the way. Now, the best way to do that is if you have a 7mm hex driver. It'll actually help you get those installed relatively easy. So let's do that right now. Another thing you can do is you can actually put a little bit of grease onto the thread, which might help it get threaded into the boss a little bit easier. All right, so I've started the 2 shoulder screws into the bosses. Now I'm going to put the battery in place so I can establish their proper height so that these sit flush with the battery. Now, I should mention one little thing. The kit itself does come with these pieces of foam that are self-adhesive, and they are supposed to go on either side of the chassis rails. Now, I didn't install these. This is done relatively early on in the build. I didn't do this in this case because I didn't have the battery at the time. I'm going to go ahead and actually do this probably off camera. It's really not critical for this step, but just be aware that this was something that I didn't do during the actual build. All right, so hopefully you guys can see that, but now the shoulder screws are flush with the top of the battery. That now brings us to the end of step number 2. Let's move on to step number 3. Okay, so step number 3 has us installing the battery strap onto the 2 shoulder screws that we just installed in the previous step. So let's gather the parts together we need in order to do that. First things first, we're going to need the battery strap itself, which is right here on this sprue right here. We don't need these 2 pieces here, so let's get this off the sprue right now. All right, there's the battery strap. This is the top face, and the pretty much flat side is the bottom face. Next, we're going to need 2 battery strap nuts, and those are actually on the same sprue. They give you 4, so let's take 2 of these off right now. Next, we're going to need 2 3x8mm washers, which are right over here. There they are right there. And we're going to need 2 M3x6mm button head cap screws, which are right over here. There they are. All right, so now that we have everything we need, we can go ahead and actually assemble our battery strap. So let's do that right now. All right, so the battery strap is now completely assembled. Good. Now we can go ahead and move on to the second part of step 3, which is to install the battery strap onto the chassis itself. So let's get that back into frame. All right, now the one thing to be aware of when installing the battery strap, it's that these protruding pieces are supposed to be forward facing in vehicle, and ultimately the 2 shoulder screws that we just installed should make their way through the 4th hole right there and there. So let's do that right now. All right, so battery strap is now in place. It's a very tight fit. And next, we're going to need 2 thumb screws, which are right over here. Very nice anodized blue pieces, which will fit on each of the 2 shoulder screws. All right, so that now is the battery strap complete. And that brings us to the end of step 3. Let's move on to step number 4. All right, so step 4 has us assembling the optional chassis brace. Now this chassis brace goes between the battery strap that we've just installed and the top of the gearbox. Now, in order to use this chassis brace, you have to actually remove the waterfall brace that we installed earlier on in the build. I'm not really sure I'm going to use this particular chassis brace. However, in the interest of completeness, I'm gonna actually go ahead and assemble this anyway. So in order to do that, let's get all the parts together that we're gonna need. First, let's get a 3x48mm turnbuckle, which is right here. Next, we're going to need 2 rod ends, which are on this sprue right over here. Now, the 2 rod ends that we need are the 2 really long ones, which are here and here. So let's get those off the sprue right now. And we're also going to need 2 shock pivot balls, which are right over here. There they are. And then ultimately, when we do decide, or if we do decide to use this chassis brace, we're also going to need to use a 3x16mm flat head cap screw, which is right here, and a M3 lock nut, which is right over here. So now let's go ahead and assemble this brace. Now, much like when we assembled the turnbuckles for the steering and the suspension, we can do the same thing with this particular brace by putting a little bit of grease inside each of the rod ends to help actually thread it onto the turnbuckle. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so the turnbuckle is now complete. However, according to the instructions, we have to set the distance between the cups to 29mm, so I'll do that right now. All right, so the distance has now been set. Now we have to install the shock pivot balls. And in order to do that, we turn back to our shock pliers. So let's get these installed right now. Okay, so now the chassis brace is complete. But of course, as I said, I'm not going to be using this, so I'm gonna just set this off to the side right now while we get on to step number 5. All right, so the first part of step 5 has us installing both the body and the front wing. Now, in my case, I've already purchased a professionally painted body, but I'm not going to be revealing that until the end of the video. So those of you who've come this far, if you stick around till the end of the video, you'll get to see what the final buggy looks like with the fully painted body. However, we can go ahead and install the front wing. Now, I've already gone ahead and trimmed out the front wing. So now that we have the wing, what we're going to need next in order to install it are 2 M3 by 4mm button head cap screws, which are right over here. There they are right there. And we can go ahead and just get started mounting the wing. So let's do that right now. All right, so the front wing is now installed. All right, so the second part of step 5 has us installing the rear wing. Now, just like with the front wing, I've already trimmed out the rear wing, so it's ready to go. However, we're gonna need a few more pieces in order to get it installed. First, we're gonna need 2 M3 by 10mm flathead cap screws, which are right over here. There they are. Next, we're going to need 2 wing buttons as well as our wing mount. Now, as we've seen before, neither of these 2 parts are actually in parts bag 10. Instead, they're found in parts bag 6, and they are on this sprue right here. Here's our wing buttons, and that is our wing mount. So let's get these off this sprue right now. All right, so now that we have all our parts together, we can go ahead and install the rear wing. Now, according to the instructions, there's 3 different positions that you can mount the rear wing. I'm going with the kit option, which is a 6-degree mount. That places our wing mount in this orientation on the wing stays. We need our wing. All right, so that now is the rear wing installed on the buggy. And that brings us to the end of step 5. Let's move on to step number 6. All right, so step 6 deals entirely with trimming the included clear polycarbonate body that comes with the B6.3 and B6.3D kits. Now, as I've already mentioned, I have a professionally painted body that I'll be revealing at the end of this video, so I won't be trimming or mounting the included kit body. However, I did want to say a few words about it before moving on. First of all, when it comes to trimming the body, you'll notice a number of scribe lines that you're supposed to follow as you trim the body. Please make sure that you follow the appropriate scribe line. I've heard from a couple of folks who made the mistake of following the wrong scribe line and ended up with a body that was trimmed for a stand-up transmission instead of the lay-down or lay-back transmissions that come with our cars. So take your time when you trim, and remember, you can always trim it off, but you can't add it back on. So if you're not sure, you're far better off following the outermost scribe line, checking the fit, than trimming back only if you need to. Secondly, I cannot stress the importance of good tools when it comes to body trimming. I use a set of curved and straight polycarbonate trimmers from Tamiya, but tools like these are available from a number of suppliers. ProTech, Team Associated, TLR, Huddy, and a number of other well-known brands offer high-quality polycarbonate body scissors. Personally, when it comes to trimming buggy bodies, I find the straight scissors to be more useful than the curved ones. However, others may say different. I strongly urge you to spend that little bit extra and get both a straight and a curved set, and if you look after them, they'll last a long time. Thirdly, a good body reamer is another one of those tools that you don't realize how you got along without it until you get one. Like body trimmers, these are also available from a number of reputable brands. This one happens to be a ProTech RC one, but ultimately do yourself the favor, if you don't already have one, get one. My final tips when it comes to body trimming is about files, sanding blocks, and motorized tools like a Dremel rotary tool. Files and sanding blocks are fine for cleaning up some jagged edges, but be prepared to be at it for a while, as sanding, even with an aggressive file or sanding block, is not a quick process. But the final results can be worth it. As for rotary tools like a Dremel, I would say to avoid using these until you have a few RC bodies under your belt. Rotary tools are not for the inexperienced, and I would suggest if you want to try using one, get an old cheap RC body you don't care about and practice on that first before you hack away on your own B6.3 body. All right, that's all I have to say about step 6. Let's move on to step number 7. Alright, so step 7 deals entirely with mounting the tires to the wheels. Now, much like the electronics, wheels and tires aren't included with your B6.3 or B6.3D kit. And while not including wheels is a little bit odd, the reason tires aren't included is because racers select the appropriate tire for the track they're running on. So rather than giving customers a mediocre tire in their kits, the folks at Team Associated basically let racers decide which tires they want to run based on the track they're running on. And to that end, I can't stress enough the importance of visiting your local track and talking to folks there about which tires they would recommend. People will gladly let you know which tires they've either had good experience with or have seen or heard others have good experiences with, which is exactly what I did. And I ended up getting a set of Proline carpet tires for my Buggy. For the front, I have Proline Prisms, and for the rear, I have Proline Pyramids, both in a medium compound. As for wheels, there's a number of brands on the market that make great wheels for these buggies. For myself, I decided to stick with a set of Team Associated wheels in yellow. There's no real reason why I went with Team Associated wheels, but the reason I chose the yellow wheels is because they tend to be a bit easier to see when your car is on the track, which is another tip that I heard from more than one racer. But on the subject of wheels, I did want to mention one thing. Now, the rear wheels are the same size regardless of which surface you plan to run your buggy on, be it carpet, clay, or dirt. That's not the case for the fronts, however, with most folks who run on carpet using the slim front wheels and the accompanying slim front tires. This is largely due to the fact that carpet surfaces have so much more grip than clay or dirt that running the wider front wheels and tires you see on dirt or clay cars will result in what's called traction rolling, where the car has so much traction it simply rolls whenever you attempt to enter a corner. So if you're building a car that will be primarily raced on carpet, use the slim front wheels instead of the regular front wheels. All right, so now with all that out of the way, let's open these up and get to mounting them. All right, so we now have our tires and wheels out of their packages. Now we can go ahead and mount them up. We're gonna start with the front wheels and tires. Now, the one thing I do wanna mention is you'll notice the fronts do not have any inserts, whereas the rears do. That's actually quite normal for carpet tires. Clay and dirt tires would have inserts for both front and rear. So let's just go ahead and get these mounted up. All right, that's one tire and wheel mounted. Let's get on to do the second one. All right, so now the two front wheels and tires are mounted. Let's get on to the rears. All right, so mounting the rear tires is a little bit more involved than the fronts, which is we need to first put the foam inserts into the tires themselves and then put the tire onto the rim. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so the foam inserts are now in their respective tires. Let's go ahead and mount these onto the rims. That's one. Let's get on to doing the second one. All right, so now both rear tires are mounted. Now, according to the instructions, we're also supposed to apply CA glue to the inside of each of the tires on both sides. Now, I'm not gonna actually be doing that in this video, and the reason why is because I'm going to be making a tire mounting video, so I'm gonna leave it for that. With respect to this build, we're gonna pretend that I put glue around the inside of the wheels and tires. So we can now consider step number 7 complete. Let's move on to step number 8. All right, so step 8, quite simply, has us installing our wheels and tires onto the buggy itself. And all we need to do that are 4 M4 low profile serrated steel wheel nuts, which are all right here. There they are. And installing the wheels and tires to the buggy is quite simply ensuring that the hex on the back of each wheel mates up with the hex on each of the axles. So let's go ahead and mount these wheels and tires onto the buggy itself. All right, and that now brings us to the end of step 8 and the end of this build. Now, as promised, here's the finished buggy. So there it is, guys, the completed buggy. Now I realize I still have a bit of work ahead of me to really consider this one finished. Gluing the tires to the wheels, soldering the ESC wires to the motor, adding the battery connectors, charging the battery, calibrating the ESC, then finally setting the steering servo endpoints. And that's all before even giving the car a shakedown run. But as far as the kit instructions are concerned, I'm considering this build series officially complete. And I have to say, with the finished body installed, I think the car looks pretty awesome. By the way, you may have noticed this is not the kit supplied body. Instead, I opted to go with a J-Concepts F2 body and wing, as it seems to be a favorite of many of the Associated factory team drivers. Now, I realize this video has gone on way longer than any previous build video, but building shocks and installing electronics aren't quick parts of any RC build. So if you've made it this far in the video, then consider hitting that subscribe button. And if you've been following along from the very beginning of the build series, then I'd like to thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this video, and indeed the entire series, useful, if not mildly entertaining. And if you have, go ahead and hit that like button, and subscribe if you want to see what's next for this B6.3, or to check out any of the other RC projects I have planned. And with that said, thanks so much for watching, guys. It's now time to get this thing ready to hit the track. I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.